So yeah, it's lovely to be here. Wow, sound is quite loud. Yeah, lovely to be here. Lovely to spend today with you. Lovely to spend tomorrow with you. And great to talk about product strategy now. And I thought the way I'd like to approach the topic is by discussing mistakes I see product teams make. I've seen product teams make quite often, regularly over the years. So there are 5 mistakes I'd like to discuss with you. But before I dive into those pitfalls, I'd like to make sure that we have a shared understanding of what a product strategy is, and might be helpful to have one, or at least communicate my ideas. So what is a product strategy? Very briefly, in a nutshell, well, I like to say that a product strategy describes the approach that we've chosen to achieve product success. To offer a product that is successful, that creates the desired value for users, customers, and the business. And a good way I find to think about product strategy is to view it as a decision-making framework or guardrails that help us make more specific, detailed product decisions, particularly around product discovery and delivery, that help us select the right features, help us determine the right product functionality and the right UX design. And there are a number of elements, pieces of information that I find super helpful to capture in a product strategy. The first one is who a product is for and why people would want to use it. The second one is the value the product should create for the business, why a company should spend money on the product, so what are the desired business benefits. And the last one is about how the product is differentiated, what sets it apart from alternatives or competing offerings. I'll say a little bit more about how you can capture a product strategy and how you can articulate those pieces of information shortly. But yeah, that in a nutshell is what I would describe as a product strategy. Now, if that's a product strategy, then why is it helpful to have one? Well, there are 3 benefits I'd like to point out. The first one is that, whoops, no, can't use my clicker. The first one, okay. The first one is that it helps us determine the right outcomes and discover the right features and functionality. So another way to put this is to say, if you don't have a product strategy, if you don't have an effective product strategy, how do you know which outcomes, which product goals, which objectives you should choose? How do you know which features you should implement and which features you shouldn't? Is it gut feeling? Is it purely intuition? Or is it what your most senior stakeholder tells you? But what's your basis for making those decisions? And then talking about stakeholders, another benefit that I see with the product strategy is that it helps us set expectations. It helps align stakeholders, guide development teams, making sure people move forward together and thereby avoiding confusion and wasted effort. That's at least the idea. And finally, a product strategy is not only the basis for making the right decisions around features and functionality, but also selecting the right technologies and the right architecture, in avoiding that we choose technologies that are hip, that are hyped, or everybody says like, oh, you got to do it, you got to do it, you got to use it. I'm not thinking of a specific type of technology here. I'm not thinking of AI, but really choose those technologies, those tools that are helpful to create the desired value. So that those are 3 key benefits. Now, if product strategy is important and if it delivers all these amazing benefits, you'd think that as product managers, as product owners, or generally as a product management community, we'd be really good at practicing product strategy. But that's unfortunately not always the case. So let's look at the first mistake. And that is that there is no clear strategy or no clearly articulated and understood strategy. Now, I'd argue that any product that has been around for a little while must have a strategy. It must have users, it must create some value for them, and it must offer some benefits to the company, because otherwise it wouldn't be offered anymore, it wouldn't be around anymore. But I find that it's not uncommon that strategic decisions are made by a senior person, in that the strategy is essentially in the head of product, or a chief product officer, VP of product management, director of product management, whatever a senior product leadership role might be called in your organization. But it hasn't been necessarily described and clearly articulated. And the issue with that is if the strategy hasn't been made visible, if it's not known and understood, well, how can we then use it to make the right product decisions? How can we use it as a decision-making framework? It's kind of hard. So then the first step for me is to make that strategy transparent, make it visible, and clearly describe it. And there are different ways how you can frame a strategy, how you can capture a product strategy. I'm showing you a specific approach that I developed a number of years ago. I think I published the first version of this template back in 2011. I was looking for a way to describe a product strategy in a simple, effective way, and I couldn't really find any approach that I thought was helpful. So I created this little tool called the Product Vision Board. If you like it, you can download it for free together with a handy checklist from my website. However, I'm not here to sell a tool to you or persuade you to use a specific template. And it's really important for me to point out strategy is not about filling out a specific template and ticking some boxes. That's not the point. The point is to ask the right questions and answer them effectively. So use whatever tool and template helps you with this. So I'm using Microsoft PowerPoint here to share these slides with you. So I thought I might as well use Microsoft PowerPoint to show you how you might want to apply this template and what kind of level of detail I'd be looking at looking for in a product strategy. So for some reason, my clicker's already started to show the vision, and you can see the first element here in this structure is the vision. So I like to start with the vision of a product, which really describes the ultimate purpose for offering it, the reason why we work on the product, the positive change we'd like to see in the world. And for a slideware tool like Microsoft PowerPoint, I would suggest it's something like inform and inspire people. So it's nice, I think, to work with a big vision, a big, hairy, audacious goal that is somewhat inspirational and moves people forward. So think of it as the North Star. You might never really reach it. You might never truly fulfill your vision, but it aligns people and offers a sense of forward momentum and direction. And then the strategy itself has 4 elements: a target group, needs, a product, and business goals. And again, these are key pieces of information I'd really encourage you to describe in any strategy that you or any strategy format that you choose. Any strategy format that you use should talk about those 4 pieces of information. So target group are the users and customers, the market and market segments that your product should address. And when we look at Microsoft PowerPoint, we have a number of different segments here. We have consumers, we've got businesses, and then we've got small, mid-sized businesses, large businesses. Users are consumers, but users are also employees. And then we've got here purchase departments as customers. So a pretty big and pretty heterogeneous target group. Now that's due to 2 facts, I guess. So there are 2 reasons for this. The first one is Microsoft PowerPoint is pretty old. Does anybody know how old it is? I don't either. But as far as I know, Microsoft purchased it together with Word and Excel in the early 80s. So it's been around for a while. I hope that none of the original source code is left in the product, but you never quite know. So it's been around for a while. It's an established product. That's one reason. The other reason is that Microsoft has decided not to offer specific versions or variants for different markets or segments, right? So Microsoft could have chosen to offer a PowerPoint Enterprise Edition, but so far they've resisted that temptation. Hence, the target group is pretty big. But no matter how big your target group is, describe it in such a way that you can tell who should benefit from your product and who shouldn't. So it's a mistake to try and please everyone, and the risk that you then take is that you don't do a good job for anybody. I think Michael Porter once said it's an essential element of strategy to clearly say what not to do, to say no to options. So focus, that focus creates alignment, and again, it helps you then discover the right product goals, objectives, and the right features. Similarly, when it comes to the needs, focus on the main need, the primary needs, the main problem that your product should solve, the main benefit it should offer, or the primary job it should help users do. So in this case here, I'm suggesting allow the users to visualize information and deliver engaging presentations. So there's nothing wrong with adding additional needs, but generally speaking, limit the number of needs to 3 to 5 and clearly prioritize them. So again, that creates focus, it creates alignment, and as I've said, I find it beneficial to focus on the main need. If that is really tricky for you, then sometimes that indicates that maybe you need to do a little bit more, tiny bit more of market research work to really be able to call out those needs. And then the product column is there, so you can say what kind of product it is and what are its standout features. What are those aspects that say, oops, I'm sorry, I'm going way too fast, and somehow my clicker is not working the way I want it to work. Or I can't operate it, and it's a user error. Not quite sure which one it is. So those aspects, those qualities, capabilities of your product that make it stand out, set it apart from competing offerings. I've suggested 3 here. And that's particularly helpful for commercial revenue-generating products, but it's also generally helpful for end-user facing products. And some of my clients where teams are responsible for internal products also find it helpful to list those standout features to clearly communicate why it's worthwhile to invest in an in-house developed tool and not to use a third-party one. And then last but not least, it's important to clearly describe what the value is that the product creates for the business. So what is the positive impact that your product will make on the business? Here we have that it generates revenue, but also that it increases the attractiveness of Microsoft 365, the suite it belongs to, and keeps users in the Microsoft ecosystem. So yeah, clearly describe what are the desired business goals and how will the product generate value for your company. So that, generally speaking, is what I would consider to be an effective description of a product strategy, and that's the level of detail that I'd be looking for. As you can see, there are no targets stated here, and I haven't mentioned any timeframes, and that's intentional. I wouldn't expect that you're able to state targets, and I wouldn't necessarily encourage you to state any specific dates or timeframes, periods. That's something that'll happen later when you derive a product roadmap from such a overarching higher level product strategy. So yeah, that's the first step. And if you're currently not sure if you have a strategy, then maybe talk to the person who so far has been in charge of strategic decisions. Maybe work with the individual to capture your product strategy. If you're the person, then maybe sit down and maybe involve others. Maybe important stakeholders and some development team representatives in articulating target group needs and so forth to make sure that the current strategy is made visible. So you can look at it and you can use it and you can assess if it's still helpful, if it's still helpful in order to move the product forward and shape the future. Because a strategy should always be forward-looking and it should always help you make the right decisions in the coming weeks and months. So that was the first pitfall that I wanted to explore with you. The second one would be to have a strategy or work with a strategy that sounds maybe amazing, it looks great, and everybody's super enthusiastic about it, but it's not really backed up by empirical evidence, by data. So for me, an effective product strategy is more than just a loose bet. It shouldn't be built just on past experience, opinions, ideas, or possibly speculation. It should really be supported by, as I said, by empirical evidence, by data. So how can we do this? Well, I like to use a process that was originally pioneered by Eric Ries in the context of lean startup, where we iteratively correct and refine the strategy, thereby systematically de-risking it, systematically addressing the major risks that it contains. So again, the first step is to capture your strategy. The first step is to make your strategy visible, and then look at this strategy and assess it and say, are there any major risks? Does it contain any major assumptions? So for instance, the target group statement that you've chosen, the users and the customers, the market segment, on what data is that based? Is it backed up by any data? And if that's not the case, well, maybe you should do a little bit of research. Maybe you should interview some users. Maybe you should interview some customers. Maybe you should observe them. So you know that you've chosen the right target group, most likely. Yeah. And then once you've selected the biggest risk, decide how to address it. So I've just mentioned direct observation and user interviews, but if it's a technical risk, it's maybe more about creating a spike, a throwaway prototype. If it's about a risk related to the ability to generate a desired business benefit. Maybe you need to do some business modeling, possibly even some due diligence and evaluate a supplier. And then carry out those interviews, build that prototype, do the business modeling, collect the relevant data, and then decide what to do next, learn from it. And so typically it means that you either stick with your strategy, but you might have to correct it, you might have to refine it, maybe the need statement needs to be adjusted, maybe the target group is a little bit too big or a little bit too small, maybe one of the business goals isn't quite realistic, or one of the standout features isn't quite strong enough, isn't compelling enough, or maybe it turns out that actually this strategy is ill-conceived, and you need to pivot, you need to change. Think of, for instance, YouTube pivoting from a, dating website to a video sharing platform. Just to mention one famous pivot. And the third option would be that you don't find a way to make this strategy work, and you would then stop the innovation initiative. And the idea is that you, as I said, iterate over your initial strategy until you've addressed all risks relating to desirability, feasibility, viability, and ethicality. So desirability risks are related to a market not being big enough and the need not being strong enough. Feasibility risks are related to your ability to develop the product, so having the right technologies and enough people with the right skills. Viability is about being able to derive the desired business benefits and ultimately monetizing the product. And ethicality means that your product doesn't create any harm for the users, people, and the planet. So again, the benefit of that is you have a strategy that's not only been articulated, that not only sounds amazing, but that is backed up by empirical evidence. And that's no guarantee that it will result in a successful product. It's no guarantee, but you can be confident that you have a solid decision-making framework in place. So that was the second pitfall. Now the third one has something to do with a bicycle. What kind of bicycle is that? Does anybody recognize what that might be?
Gravel.
Say that again, sorry.
Gravel.
A gravel bike. I'm not sure that you can ride, I wouldn't want to ride a bike like this out on the trails, or I wouldn't want to do any gravel riding with it, but that's a personal choice.
Fixie.
It's a fixie, yes, thank you. What is a fixie? Why is it called a fixie?
Fixed gear.
Yes, a fixed gear. And how many gears?
One.
Yeah, and usually no free hub. So what does it mean? If it only has one gear, no free hub? Well, it means it's hard work riding up the hills, and it's difficult to ride it down a hill because you have to keep your legs spinning. Now I like bikes, I like riding bikes, but I'm not a big fan of fixies. Certainly not out, on the roads or on the trails. I understand that they have their place in the velodrome on the track, but I don't find them, practical as a commuter bike or as a leisure bike. And so, similarly, I'm not a big fan of viewing the strategy as fixed. I know that's sort of a, making a jump, but at least I was able to talk a little bit about bikes. So one of my favorite pastime activities. So I'm not a big fan of viewing strategy as fixed. And traditionally, I'd like to point out, strategy is done once in a while, maybe once a year, maybe even less frequently. And then for the next year, for the next 2-3 years, maybe for the next 4 or 5 years, we execute that strategy, of course, flawlessly. Yeah. But I think in a world that is as dynamic as ours, and particularly when it comes to digital products, there's so much change that concept, is no longer helpful. So I think it's much better to see strategy as something that it needs to be adapted, as being fluid, as being flexible, and seeing the strategy work not as a stage or phase, generally speaking, but more as a process, as a workflow, as a continuous workflow. So I'm trying to say that strategy is something you need to look at on a continued basis and not just once in a blue moon. Yeah? And the reason for that is not to miss out on any developments, to spot opportunities and threats early on. So you can be proactive and you have a choice and you're not reactive, you're not surprised by developments, you're not being leapfrogged by a competitor and suddenly you find yourself with your back against the wall and you've got an emergency or a crisis at your hands that you have to manage. Yeah. So the whole point, as I said earlier, about using a product strategy is to shape the future, to have choices, to make the right decisions. So in order to ensure that, we have to make sure that our strategy we start with is valid, but that it stays valid, it stays helpful. And these techniques that I'm sharing with you now should help you with this. So if we want to practice strategy regularly or continuously, we need to make time for it. And the first technique, or the first measure I'd like to suggest here, is probably not particularly new to many of you, and that is to review strategy, our product strategy, a product strategy, on a quarterly basis. The way I like to suggest doing it is by organizing a collaborative workshop and inviting key stakeholders and development team representatives. So you leverage their perspectives, realign people, and make sure that everybody's on the same page. Now, those quarterly reviews, that are great to look at bigger trends and look at more data. But when you think about the rate of change that is happening, it may not be frequently enough. So in order to, again, be proactive and avoid that we overlook any developments, I like to suggest complementing the quarterly reviews with weekly strategy work. So my suggestion is that the person in charge of the product manager or product owner, or whoever makes the strategic decisions, spends a little bit of time every week reviewing the strategy, looking at the data that becomes available on a frequent basis. Now, a little bit of time is somewhere between 2 and 4 hours, and that's usually enough. Sometimes, depending on where your product is in its life cycle and how dynamic the market is, you don't need 2 hours. You can get away with less. But it's important in both cases, for quarterly reviews and for those weekly pieces of work, that you set the time aside and that you protect that strategizing time. I think in product management, we often have a tendency to optimize for urgent work, but that urgent work isn't necessarily always the important work. And as I indicated earlier, if you deprioritize or you neglect strategic work, chances are that there's more unplanned work in the future, that you have more emergencies to deal with in the future. So as hard as it is to free up time in your calendar, as hard as it can be to make enough time to do the strategy work, by doing so, you'll actually protect yourself and you'll actually make your life easier in the future. Now, if those are some measures to get the work done, then what does the work entail? Well, a number of factors that I like to recommend. The first one is using KPIs, key performance indicators, to see how much value is your product creating. What KPIs do you use? GMV, and that stands for? Okay. Any other KPIs anybody uses? Conversion rate. Churn rate, yes. Customer effort or customer satisfaction score, yeah, or net promoter score is what some people use. Monthly recurring revenue might be another one, or cost incurred on a monthly basis. Yeah. So those metrics should ultimately help you understand if you're making progress towards meeting the needs and business goals that you've captured in your product strategy. Another reason why it's a good idea to have a product strategy and clearly articulate it. So use your KPIs to see if your product is creating the desired value, because if it isn't, then there are two possible explanations. One is there's something wrong with the execution piece, but assuming that the development teams are doing a good job, then it may indicate that the strategy is no longer effective. Yeah. Then the second factor is to look at trends, look at consumer trends, technology trends, regulatory trends. Think about the recent cost of living crisis. Is it recent? It's been going on for a few years. I'm not sure how this is for you guys in Poland, but in the UK, it's like, oh my God, things just seem to be getting more expensive all the time. So consumer trends, technology trends, Gen AI, of course, and legal trends, to which extent that affects you will depend on the market that your product serves. So if you're in healthcare or finance or telco, then you can probably expect that there are regular legal changes that may impact the strategy. Ooh, I'm going too fast again. And then development insights. Are there any major changes to the product roadmap? Any major changes coming out of the development work, the development progress, for instance, that might impact the strategy? The competitive landscape and the competition in general has a new competitor entered the scene? Has an existing competitor launched a new feature, an important feature, or updated a key feature, or have they maybe even launched a new product? Is that something you want to respond to? Yeah, and what is the right strategic answer? So again, important to keep an eye on this. And then finally, what about other strategies in the organization, particularly the business strategy? I'll talk about this shortly a little bit more, but if the business strategy changes, that typically necessitates a change of the product strategy. Why? Well, at the end of the day, a product is a value-creating vehicle. It exists to generate value for the users and customers as well as the business. And so in that sense, any product should really help execute the business strategy. So you can use this as a little checklist in order to assess if a strategy is still valid. If the KPIs show that everything's fine, if you don't need to respond to any trends, there are no major changes in the competition, the business strategy is stable, and the development, the delivery piece is all working nicely, it looks like, wow, your strategy is right. Well done. Keep monitoring it, but no major changes are needed. However, if some of those factors indicate that things aren't quite so good, then you should probably respond to it and respond to it soon. There are two more challenges or pitfalls, mistakes that I'd like to discuss with you. The fourth one is to view the product strategy as being isolated and making strategic decisions in isolation, and thereby disconnecting it from higher level strategic choices and from delivery. But a product strategy that is disconnected, that doesn't guide, that doesn't direct ultimately discovery and delivery, isn't particularly useful. It's just a theoretical exercise. So how can we make sure that our strategy is not isolated? Well, the approach I'd like to share with you uses a little framework that I've developed over the past couple of years called the strategy stack. Just like with the product vision board, you don't have to do it that way, of course, as long as you find a way to, as I said, build the right connections. Now, any business benefits from having a business strategy that articulates, that states how the company as a whole will succeed, continue to be successful. Sometimes the business strategy is referred to as company strategy, and people like to capture elements like the aspiration of the business, the markets and product categories the business wants to be in, wants to be active in, wants to serve, the competitive advantage that the business has. And some people like Roger Martin add then things like the capabilities that have to be provided or enhanced and the type of management systems that are required in order to be successful. So in a way, the business strategy is the foundation for making specific strategic decisions for a product. As I said earlier, a product is a value-creating vehicle. It should help move the business. Move forward. But larger organizations need more than just a business strategy because they have more than a single product. They have groups of products. They have portfolios. So again, I'm using Microsoft PowerPoint here, and Microsoft PowerPoint is part of what? Microsoft Office, what used to be called Office, yes. Now it's called 365. It's been called 365 for a few years, so they rebranded Office. I've never quite understood why, but it's probably just my age. I just so attached to the Office brand. So yes, so if I was in charge of Microsoft, I'd like to see something like a strategy for Microsoft 365 for Microsoft Office that states how a group of products, in this case PowerPoint, Excel, Word, and a few others, will create value together. Yeah. And the portfolio strategy then guides the product strategy. Mm-hmm. So that's the way I like to play it. Business strategy informs portfolio strategy guides the product strategy, which also means that if you follow this model, then strategic product decisions are bound by portfolio decisions. Yeah. But again, certainly for a cohesive portfolio like Microsoft 365, that probably makes sense. Now, next, I'm sorry about this. So I'm not quite sure what's wrong with my clicker. It likes to show more than a single, do more than a single animation, show more than a single element. So next to the portfolio and product strategy, I like to show the product strategy, and then underneath the product strategy and technology strategy, we have roadmaps. Initially the product roadmap. Now, I stated earlier that the way I like to articulate a strategy is there usually no targets and timeframes, and those targets and timeframes are shown on a roadmap. I like to work with an outcome-based, goal-oriented roadmap that talks about the specific benefits that a product should create, typically bi-monthly or quarterly benefits. So there you can state targets, there you can be specific, and you then have your timeframes, your quarters, or your 2 months periods. And then next to it, you might want to use a technology strategy that does a similar job for a technology roadmap that does a similar job for the technology strategy. And then at the bottom is the product backlog. Now, the backlog, strictly speaking, isn't a strategic artifact, but I've added it here for completeness sake, as the product strategy should direct the product roadmap, and road mapping decisions should then inform the backlog. So the idea is that ultimately your product backlog items are indirectly connected to your business strategy, but certainly are ultimately guided by your product strategy and informed by strategic product decisions, and so that your product strategy is systematically implemented, systematically executed. Yeah. There shouldn't be any strategy execution gap. It'd be wrong if there was a group of people, deciding on the product strategy, and another completely different group of people doing the discovery and delivery work, and they didn't talk to each other, they didn't know each other, there was no sharing, no shared understanding of the strategic decisions. Then the strategy would be just wasted effort. Yeah. So that was connecting the strategy in an effective manner. And then the last thing that I'd like to discuss with you is around ownership and the question of who should own the product strategy. Who of you who work as product people has ownership of the product strategy? If you dare to show your hands. A few people have. That's great. Yeah, that's great for you. My experience is that that's not always the case. And I find it's not uncommon that strategic decisions are essentially made by a senior person, again, often a head of product, chief product officer, or another senior stakeholder. And now that can be an effective solution on a more temporary basis while a group of product managers is being built up, while those individuals have the opportunity to upskill and maybe learn more how to make effective strategic decisions. But I find as a long-term solution, it's not necessarily effective. Well, there are two reasons for this. The first one is if a head of product makes the strategic decisions for all the products in the portfolio, as those products grow and as the portfolio grows, that becomes more and more work. There's a risk that the person becomes overworked and a bottleneck, and strategic decisions are slowed down. But then I think from a product perspective, as product managers and product owners, it's nice to not only to, debate features and discuss features, but, be empowered, have the authority to have full stack ownership and shape the strategy of our products. So I think, it's a motivating factor for us. So what I like to recommend is empowering product teams to have that full stack ownership and own the strategy of their products. What is a product team? So, product team is an ambiguous term, I guess, but most terms in product management I find have an element of ambiguity. So a product team is usually made of a product manager, and then we have here a UX designer, tech lead, and tester, sometimes also referred to as the trio, even though I'm showing a quartet here. And that group of people is sometimes called the core product team. And the individuals here with their expertise and knowledge are usually in a good position to guide product discovery and delivery, to guide the work that is necessary to identify the right pieces of functionality, features, right user experience, and then deliver an appropriate solution. However, if you'd like them to be able to make effective strategic decisions, they often lack some knowledge around, for instance, for a commercial revenue generating product like Microsoft PowerPoint, around marketing strategy, sales strategy, marketing and sales channels, and so forth. So what I like to recommend is to add key stakeholders and form an extended product team. And so again, for Microsoft PowerPoint, key stakeholders might include a marketeer, a sales rep, a customer support team member. For other products, it might be somebody from operations or legal, or another department, another business unit. Very much depends on your org structure and the type of product that you look after. Now, the benefit of adding those key stakeholders to this group, this extended, this bigger product team, is that that allows you to leverage their expertise, their knowledge, and hopefully make better decisions. But it also increases the chances that there's a shared understanding of important strategic decisions. And so there's stronger alignment. And my experience suggests that if you invite people to make a decision or influence a decision, help shape a decision, they're more likely to feel ownership of that decision. They're more likely to see it through and implement it, as long as you appreciate what they have to say and listen to them with an open mind. Now, some of you might be thinking that sounds all good and well, but he doesn't know my stakeholders. They're not easy to deal with. They're very opinionated, they're powerful, they're senior. Oh my God, they're just going to walk all over me and tell me what to do. So because we now have a pretty heterogeneous group of people, different backgrounds, different perspectives, achieving some form of agreement can be challenging, and sometimes some of those individuals may not always be the ideal team players. So it can be helpful to have a coach or a team coach who facilitates, who helps prepare workshops and sessions, ensures that everybody has the opportunity to contribute, everybody is heard, and that not the highest paid person opinion wins. The hit boy wins, the hit boy dominates. That's not really the idea here. Equally, it wouldn't be a good idea to broker a weak compromise and avoid difficult decisions and difficult conversations. I mentioned earlier that strategy work requires saying no, and that means making tough decisions. That is part and parcel of strategy. And so, don't make the mistake of brokering a weak compromise. That doesn't really help anybody. What you want to do is you want to make the right product decisions that attract as much support as possible, but you don't want to maximize the support and sacrifice the quality of your decisions. That wouldn't be the right thing. And so again, having a qualified coach, that might be an agile coach, scrum master, it might be another a qualified facilitator, can help you with this. The individual can guide you through a decision-making process, a collaborative decision-making process, and help choose the right decision rule. Yes, please. Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Yes. I'm glad you're bringing this up. Thank you. So, as you rightly said, now if we have all these empowered product teams, maybe I should briefly say what is the benefit of that. So benefit of that can be higher employee motivation. We've avoided the risk that the head of product becomes a bottleneck. We now make sure that strategic decisions, or we increase the chances that strategic decisions actually do inform tactical product decisions around the product backlog, around discovery and delivery. So there's a higher chance that those decisions are consistent. Those are the benefits. But the risk rightly is we've got these empowered and autonomous product teams, and they go off in different directions. So we've got Word team fully empowered, great. And they go off to the left. And then we've got PowerPoint, they're saying, well, we're going to go to the right. And then we've got Word, and they're saying, no, we're going to go straight ahead. And everybody's off going somewhere else. So how do we align them? And the answer is, at least my answer would be, it's the drawback with all those animated slides. The answer is by using a portfolio strategy, and using that portfolio strategy to direct the strategic choices for the individual products within that portfolio. So if you have a Microsoft 365, a Microsoft Office strategy, then that strategy would essentially be the basis for strategic decisions for Word, PowerPoint, and Excel. To put it differently, the Word, PowerPoint, and Excel product teams, they would have to adhere to the portfolio strategy. They are bound by the portfolio strategy. In that way, you get that desirable combination of alignment and autonomy. For me, that's the sweet spot between, empowered, autonomous product teams and sufficient integration, sufficient alignment. The other thing that I find very common and often practical is that a head of product, chief product officer, makes portfolio decisions, not necessarily on their own, but essentially is responsible for the portfolio strategy. And that means that, if you're in a situation that you are the head of product, or, you have a head of product and the head of product currently, decides on the product strategies, then, the head of product doesn't lose control totally. The control just moves up a level, but still sets the, a high level framework that guides the strategic decisions of the individual products. So that would be my suggestion. So yes, those were the empowered product teams. And I think that's all I wanted to say, leveraging the collective wisdom of this larger group of people and using a coach to ensure that that the sessions, the collaborative sessions you have are effective and that you reach as much agreement as is possible. So that brings me to my summary. I've given up on using my clicker now and using my finger. Much more reliable than using a tool. Make sure you have a clearly articulated strategy. So again, if you don't have one, I'd really encourage you, when you go back to work, write down that strategy, maybe together, as I said, with the key people in your organization, key stakeholders, maybe a head of product, maybe representatives from the development teams. And then if whenever you make bigger changes to an existing strategy or create a strategy for a brand new product, make sure that you take the time to validate it. Make sure that your strategy is sufficiently supported by empirical evidence, so you maximize the chances of achieving product success. Don't forget that strategy is only based on what we know at a given point in time. As the world changes, that knowledge might become outdated and your strategy may no longer be valid. So think of the strategy work as an ongoing process, as a continued workflow, rather than something that is done once in a blue moon. Make sure that your strategy is connected sufficiently to higher level strategies and that it guides decisions around the product roadmap and the backlog. And finally, if you can, then I think it's a worthwhile experiment to empower at least one or two of your product teams to make strategic product decisions and see how that works for you. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope that some of what I had to share was a little bit useful for you. As Piotr has already nicely or kindly said, if you'd like to learn more, there's plenty of information on product strategy on my website. And I've written a book about product strategy called Strategize. For some of you, that might be interesting.
Really good one.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we've got time for questions and then a deep dive.
Yes.
Cool.
Perfect. Thank you, Roman. So I'm gonna just put it here. Remember, to the questions that you like most.
Oh yes. Okay.
Yeah,
Oh.
I'm gonna put it
Okay.
here, and this is
Good.
just for someone.
Okay.
So any questions?
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. First of all, I hope you like my questions.
I'm sure they'll be great.
I would like to understand what is your take on when you're running this strategy meetings where you have the extended product team, how do you suggest, would you give me some tips on how to clearly separate strategy or strategic topics from more execution or more detailed hands-on roadmap backlog conversations that sometimes can come up with stakeholders?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, thank you for sharing that question. I think it's a common challenge that stakeholders want to talk about specific features or pieces of functionality that they want to see implemented. And sometimes as product people, I mean, we're so busy getting stuff built and working with development teams that we also, sometimes we can have a strong focus on features in the product backlog as well. And it can be then tempting to kind of dive down and talk about those details. I think to a certain extent, it's really about facilitating that meeting well and preparing that meeting well, understanding who's going to be in that meeting, be it online or on-site. What maybe are the tendencies of some of those individuals, and how can I help them? How can I help the group focus on the right topics, and kind of, bringing back the conversation to, this is about product strategy. This is not about specific detailed features. We'll talk about those, but we've got a different meeting, we've got a different session to address that. I don't know, if you do Scrum, it'd be the sprint review meeting, for instance, or road mapping discussions will be made in a road mapping workshop. Having said that, I do find it, generally speaking, helpful to consider combining strategy and roadmap review. But I like to start with the strategy discussion and then move on to the roadmap discussion. And the reason for that is that typically you need the same people in the workshop, in the session. And then the way I look at strategy and roadmap is that they're connected. So the strategy is the higher level decision decision-making framework, and then the roadmap says this is how we're going to implement it. So they kind of belong together, so that, kind of a package makes sense to review and adapt them together. So that might help as well. And sorry, there's one more thing I'd like to say. For those of you who work for companies in industries where traditionally you don't have a strong product management, and that's true for financial services, banks and insurance companies, that's true for media, it's true for travel, quite a few industries. Your organization might be in the process of moving more towards a product focused way of working and implementing something like, some people refer to it as implementing the product model or product operating model. And part of that is kind of re-educating everyone to think less in terms of features and functionality and more around benefits and outcomes. Well, that's a process. It takes time. And in some organizations, it takes years. And, sort of thinking about features can be so ingrained that some people just fall back into old habits. It just happens. It's just like being humans. And so it's then having patience and perseverance and, reminding people. And again, this is where having a skilled facilitator can be super helpful. So you as the product person, product manager, you don't always have to remind people, but there's someone else who helps you with this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I have a tricky question. What is your trick, if any, to convince stakeholders, especially if they are external customers, to become the part of extended product team and share the big why that typically they don't want to share, KPIs and so on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure, to be honest, that I've got a good answer for that. So if you develop a product for clients, if you, for instance, in an agency context, and you want to then encourage your client to join an extended product team, or equally, if you have a core product, but then you make customer specific customizations, and you then want the customers to join you, that can be tricky. It can be tricky to get their time and attention and commitment, but then also to establish the necessary level of trust, and so you can share, and together with the trust also to have enough psychological safety so you can have honest, frank conversations, right? And people feel safe to speak their minds and make suggestions that maybe aren't immediately everyone's, I don't know, favorite views or favorite suggestions, favorite ideas. So I'm sorry, I don't really have a good answer for that. I've primarily worked with organizations where either the applications developed were in-house applications, or there were commercial products that were then being sold in one way or the other. So sorry.
You mentioned those financial services that might be in the process of a product transformation, implementing the operating model and such. Would you have any advice for actually changing the culture to also follow that transformation? Because what I've seen a lot is that maybe a big strategic consultancy comes in and sells that product operating model, and we implement a lot of the frameworks and processes, and we do them in the product group. But actually, the center of gravity is still with the corporate strategy and with the executives who still make all the decisions. And it feels like a lot we're playing the product part, but the actual decision making and culture kind of stays in the old.
Yeah, no, I can understand what you're saying, and I've experienced similar things. So I recently published an article on the, okay, right, I don't have web access, so not a good idea to show you the browser here, but use the browser. But I recently published an article on it, so it's something maybe to refer you to. I think I published it in last month in February. But organizational change is a key aspect in successfully establishing the product operating model. And I like to suggest, and I'm not the only one who gives that recommendation, that you require senior management leadership, and ultimately that the CEO needs to sponsor that change. And as you said, often a product transition doesn't have the necessary executive senior management attention and equally sponsorship. And then the deeper changes are very difficult to make, and it's very difficult to fully establish a product focused way of working. And the same has been true with other transformations, with agile transformations, digital transformations, and it'll be very interesting to see what happens with the AI transformations that are underway. But again, I think as long as we're not willing to change structures and processes, and that's usually only possible when there is executive management support, I doubt that any of those transformations will ultimately be truly successful. So you'll get some benefits, but you won't get the breakthrough advantages that you'd hoped for. And then there's a danger that organizations are disappointed. And not only that, but some organizations, I've seen larger organizations, maybe I'm talking too much about this now, but that started a transformation but haven't really completed it. They're sort of in between the old and the new world. And so they've lost the perceived security that they've had, and all the skills that they've built up, and the mechanisms they've built up in a more traditional project-driven, feature-based world or way of working. But they haven't really built up enough skills and knowledge, and they haven't gone far enough with a product-focused way of working. So they're kind of in between, and that's not a great position to be in on a continued basis. So, but yeah, it's a real challenge, and I don't have a good answer. Apart from if you can, build connections, build relationships with the decision makers in the organizations, and try and educate or influence them in the right way.
And just maybe a quick follow-up. Have you seen any succeed organizations to transition from a non-product centric culture to a product centric culture?
No. However, I'm not saying that it hasn't happened. And I mean, there are case studies out there. So I've done a fair amount of work with financial companies in the financial industry over the years. And in healthcare, it seems that sort of the two domains that I don't know, for whatever reason, I gravitate towards: money and health. I don't know why. So, but it doesn't mean that's not the case. And there are case studies about well-known brands in that space that apparently made it. It's maybe just means that I wasn't lucky enough to work with those kind of companies. I mean, generally speaking, it's easier when you have a product management function established than to, in a way, you could say, innovate or modernize that and help people embrace maybe more contemporary ways, modern ways of working. Because I find that with my larger clients, say in the medical space, big successful companies, they still in some cases use ways of working that aren't always optimized for thinking. They're not necessarily thinking in products, but certainly setting outcomes. And they know about strategy, they know about roadmaps, but their roadmaps are still feature based, and there's lots of discussions about features and detailed pieces of functionality. Very quickly they dive right down in kind of that outcome objective layer, if you want. So it's kind of missing or not well established. Anyway.
So, Roman, really good presentation. So I have one follow-up question around the quarterly strategy review, because there's potentially the risk of completely changing strategy every quarter. What would be good examples or outcomes or specific things that you would do in this 2 to 4 hour-ish meeting? And like what would be a successful quarterly strategy review?
Yeah, great question. So the first thing to make sure that you avoid the risk that you pivot every quarter, and that wouldn't necessarily be desirable, is to ensure that your strategy is not based on wishful thinking, built on sand, as I tried to explain earlier, but you've done some validation work. I think that is really important, because that means that your strategy is likely to have a solid core, and that mitigates the risk that it changes too frequently and too drastically. And then, in the meeting, what I would do is first of all, I think it's pretty trivial to state, but still maybe worthwhile reminding ourselves of: important to prepare the meeting, important to share information up front. So, share your KPIs and share important trends up front, and share any competitor research, competitive analysis you've done, share it up front so people have an opportunity to prepare, and then go through the key data, pieces of information, make sure there's a shared understanding, have a joint conversation, ask people for their perspectives, and then agree on the right course of action. Now, in many cases, that course of action is not going to require a major rework of the product strategy, but just some other adaptations. But the point is that you bring people together on a regular basis, and you make time and space for having a strategy conversation to allow people to reconnect, realign people, make sure they're all on the same page, and use it as an opportunity to adjust and evolve the strategy as needed. And if there is a bigger change, then usually, you kind of see it coming. So again, I prepare accordingly. And there's nothing wrong even with going into a strategy review meeting where, as the person in charge of the product, you've maybe created a new draft strategy. But my preference would then still be to try and co-create the strategy in that meeting, rather than you saying, okay, you've seen the data, we're in trouble. Here's the new strategy. What do you think? Yes or no? Because then, it can be a tough decision for people. And sometimes I find you can have the best arguments in the world, but if people don't feel heard, if they don't feel understood, if they don't feel they've had the opportunity to share, then it's very difficult for them on an emotional basis to support you and buy into. They hear all the arguments and, intellectually and think like, yeah. But then emotionally they think like, oh, but, I want to be heard. I want to contribute to this. Why didn't he ask me? Am I not important? Or, I'm saying he because, I'm using you as an example, but of course you wouldn't necessarily do this. Why didn't they invite me to share my opinion? So that's why I like to suggest that it's a collaborative event, and that you invite people to co-create, but then of course, think about having a facilitator and making sure that, it doesn't turn chaotic. I don't know, was that a little bit helpful?
Yeah. Thank you.
If it wasn't, there is still time for you to catch up later today at the after party.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So
give a big shout to Roman.
Thank you.
And Roman.